Yeah, so what is probate? A lot of people are like, I think I have to go through probate. It's one of the most common calls I get is, do I have to go through probate? What is it? Some people have never even heard of it. It's basically a court supervised process for settling assets, right? So it happens when people in Wisconsin don't have an estate plan to prevent those assets from going through the court process. And those assets are over $50,000. So if you have real estate that's going to be going through the probate process, usually it has to, if it's not jointly titled in any way, it has to go through probate, because there's no real estate nowadays that's less than $50,000, right? It just doesn't exist. I have people going through probate for plots of land with no house on it. Sometimes people think one of our most common conceptions would be, well, I have a will, so I won't need to go through probate. But usually a will alone is not enough. A will usually requires you to still go through probate, but what it does is give the court a directive for who is getting what, right? So if I say I want my house to go to my spouse in the will, that will dictates that for the court. So the court will validate the will in the probate process and make sure everything looks kosher there. You got your witnesses and all of those things. And then it also makes sure that all debts, taxes, any outlying expenses are taken care of, right? So that's one of the hardest parts about probate, is it's a really rigorous accounting process. So I always tell my clients, keep really rigorous and diligent records, because the court will scrutinize every single thing. Part of the reason why an attorney is nice, because I help make sure that you do have all those ducks in a row. And then it helps distribute any remaining assets. If you want to sell the house, do you want to sell it during probate? All these things are things that the court will review with you, that I will help you make decisions on. And then it is required if your assets are only in that person's name. So this is the probate process. It is usually 6 to 12 months. That's what I tell my clients, depending on how fast you want to move it. I have some clients who want to move things as fast as possible, and I try to do things as quickly as possible. We have to wait for the tax year that the decedent passed to close, so sometimes that's a little bit of a bar for timing. Court gives a deadline of 18 months though. So they want it closed within 18 months unless you have a good reason otherwise. So what they do in that process is, normally the beginning process is anywhere from 6 to 10 documents we draft to get a personal representative appointed. Then we go ahead and notify creditors. That's one of the bad parts about going through probate, is on top of going through the court process, you also have to publish in a newspaper to creditors to let those creditors know that person is passed. That's not something you typically have to do if you don't go through probate. So creditors can be found that normally would have just fallen off the wayside and said, I don't care that that person passed, we don't need to worry about it, we'll wipe the debt. Now say, cool, we have a probate we can attach in court, we're gonna get our money, right? So that's one of the cons as well. It is one of the processes that we notify creditors. And then we go through an inventory of all the assets, because a lot of times people who pass, especially when it's not a husband-wife situation, but instead it's a child for a parent, may not know all their parents' assets, right? You may not know every single account, or you may not tell your kids every single account you have. In those cases, a lot of the probate process is exploring what's out there. Banks will not talk to you, most creditors will not talk to you unless you have something called a domiciliary letter, which is part of the probate process. Personal representative is the person who's in charge of everything. When there's a will, you dictate who that is. So you can pick, I want my wife, I want my kids, I want this person, I want an attorney, a business. A lot of people do it. If you do not have a will, that's when you kind of you're leaving a little bit of chaos. I'm always going to be the person who recommends having a will because I'm an attorney. Take that for what you will. But without a will, the court will basically say who is directly blood relative of you that can have the ability to do this. So you have to be a direct blood relative of the person to be their personal representative, unless you are married. They are basically acting in the shoes of the person who passed, and they manage those assets and they communicate with the heirs. It is the personal representative's job to communicate all information with the heirs. So real estate and probate, it is controlled by the personal representative. That's probably one of the parts my siblings argue about the most, right? Is the one who is personal representative can say, well, I'm gonna sell it and I'll give you guys your proceeds. And then the other siblings are going, whoa, 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 I wanted to keep mom and dad's house, right? One of the most common situations I see. But it's the personal representative's call. That's kind of why there's that fight to get the personal representative status immediately, because you get to make the decisions. There can also be issues with insurance, taxes, upkeep. You have to almost immediately try really hard, especially if there's a reverse mortgage, to get some of these assets under control with the property, right? So you need to worry about, is there insurance? Did the insurance lapse when that person died? Because heaven forbid, this crazy weather, something happens, and that person's policy no longer covered them, those kids now have an empty asset, right? It's no good. Taxes, that's another one. When January 1st hits, everybody's calling me going, taxes are here, what do we do with the taxes? Have to pay those, but it's hard. A lot of the times kids don't have the money to front that kind of taxes. I mean, especially Milwaukee County taxes are astronomical these days. So to have to front that money that you weren't planning for, that can be difficult. And that's one of the responsibilities of a personal representative. They do get reimbursed off the top if you decide to sell that house, but it's an expense that has to be incurred ahead of time. And then you cannot transfer property without authority. So if I tomorrow was inheriting my parents' property and they did not put me on a transfer on death deed, or there's no estate plan, I can't show up and say, I'm gonna try to transfer this property. It will not. Everybody wants to see either a domiciliary letter or what's called, when that person passes, a PR deed. That basically says, look, I'm a personal representative, I've given authority by the court to go ahead and transfer this property. And then what makes a good personal representative? I am always looking for people who are organized and can communicate well, because that is most of this process, is just making sure your ducks are in a row. There's no room for argument if you have all the paperwork. So I tell everyone, from the date that person passes, you save everything. I always can recognize my personal representatives in my lobby in my office because they come with a big binder, right? They're the people with a ton of paperwork. So probate in and of itself is an expensive endeavor. So when you hire someone to be the personal representative, you're not only, I mean, a lot of times that person can't be both personal representative and attorney. You have to hire an attorney as well. So now you're paying double the amount of people. So I'm always pro if you can find someone who will do it within the family, or even a family friend. Doesn't have to be someone who is blood related, but someone blood related has to be the one to start the process, right? So if you can have a sibling say, hey, I'm happy to sign the paperwork saying Uncle Larry can be the person to do this, great. That's a great way to save money. I think it really depends on the family. Yeah. When I do estate planning, I try to talk to families and get to know them well enough to know whether or not a personal representative who is, a lot of time I see banks, family friend, or is a sibling or a spouse, who would be the best fit based on family circumstances. Because sometimes there's families who they're like, I know I will die and my kids will fight. And other times there's families who are like, I do not foresee it being an issue. They've talked about it. They know this is happening. And then it's a little less of a concern. I do, as a general practice for me and my firm, if you can find a family member to do it, have a family member do it, because most of the time a third party being the one to be your personal representative will eat the state. You would be shocked what they charge, and usually it's a percentage of that estate, and it will eat the estate alive. So what to do with the property? You have a couple different options. The court will basically say you can transfer the property to the heirs outright and have them keep it in the family name. That's something that a lot of people choose to do, but in this market, more often people are choosing to sell property because they can make a pretty good penny on it. So when people choose to transfer to heirs, it's based on the will or Wisconsin law. If there's a will, it's gonna follow, what did the parents want? Well, they wanted 25% going to this kid and this kid and this kid. Okay, that's how the deed is going to be written. The other option is the court will say, well, then it goes to everybody equally, whether you wanted them on it or not. So another reason why you should get a will. The personal representative is the one who signs a deed to the beneficiary. So sometimes it's a little bit strange where you have, say, Bekah and I are siblings, our parents passed, and now we're going to get this property. I'm personal representative, but I have to sign it both into my name and Bekah's name, right? So it seems a little weird because I'm signing to get it into our own names. But you're signing, you have to look at it as, there's a difference between signing as a personal representative and signing as yourself. So I always have my personal representatives sign as PR. It's a little bit different when you sign documents. So they would be in charge of that. And then your heirs receive the property. That includes any liens. So sometimes mortgage companies are more than happy to transfer the loan over to heirs. And then there's some risks with transferring to heirs. I'm always conscientious of putting 1 million people on a deed because I think it brings up problems when 1 of 5 wants to sell and the rest of you are like, no, no, no. So I'm always conscientious of the number of people we're putting on a deed. That's probably the most common dispute I see, is someone wants to sell or wants out and the rest of them are saying, well, it's not worth what you think it is. Those kind of disputes. So sometimes one of the easiest things to do in probate with a property is just to sell it and cut your losses, and you do what you want with your percentage that you got instead of being on a deed forever. But again, depends on that family dynamic. I have some families who there's 5 people on the deed and they're happy to have all 5 on the deed and it's working out great right now. The other option is to sell the property. Your personal representative would be in charge of listing and selling the property with authority. Sometimes they'll sell it to family members, to cousins. Other times they'll put it on the market. Really just depends what they want to do, what kind of process the family's agreeing to. I'm always pro talking to my personal representatives and saying, hey, you may want to talk with the family and figure out what they're most comfortable with. Some family members are happy to have it go to someone who they know. Other family members are, hey, the market's great, give me the best dollar. Then you should probably hire a realtor and we go that route. So that's why Bekah and I work together a lot. When you sell property, you also have to use that money to pay any debts of the decedent. So sometimes people will pass and there's no bank accounts in that person's name, or they had beneficiaries, it's outside of probate. Great, no problem. But the property now, when you sell it, is now a liquid asset that people can come after. So not only does the mortgage have to be paid off, but now creditors like credit card companies and medical bills can come after that and say, hey, since you liquidated that asset, we want to be paid. We know you have money laying around. So that's one of the reasons that people choose to just transfer it, because if you transfer it, most of the time the medical debt and the credit card debt just goes away with death, right? When you run out of money in probate, nobody's coming after anyone personally. And then the proceeds are just, after that point, are really distributed to the heirs, whatever's left over. Usually I recommend to people we put that money from the proceeds of the sale into an estate account where it sits until final accounting and we know what your personal representative has actually spent on this. Probate's expensive. My fees get reimbursed. Taxes get reimbursed. All the costs that I've talked about, they get reimbursed. So, whoever took the job of personal representative isn't out that money. They would get that first and foremost, and then everybody distributes equally. And then obviously the benefit of selling the property is it's clean, it's simple. Putting a house on the market right now is great. It's really probably the easiest way to close out probate is to sell that house, because there's no dispute coming on. I have a lot of people who say, well, we're gonna think about selling it after the probate process, which, okay, great. Now it's transferred in everybody's name. And then they come back to me and they're like, well, now we have to do this and deed transfer, and we're starting this process basically all over again. Not with the probate court, but with making sure the deeds and the title. And if you're gonna do that process, make it part of the probate and have everybody split the cost evenly. So common pitfalls in owning real estate that you are inheriting through the probate process. Like I talked about, lapsed insurance. People forget about the insurance aspect. And then suddenly a big one in winter is that people forget that it gets very cold. And if you're not checking up on that property, I have a lot of personal representatives who live out of state, right? Not the whole family lives in Wisconsin. So to inherit a property in Wisconsin, then they're like, oh, the pipes froze. That's a problem, right? So I'm always keeping on my personal representatives to make sure, okay, what's the winter situation? Do we have insurance on the house? Do we get the insurance transferred? Poor communication. Most of my heir issues come from someone not telling other people what's going on. Heirs are usually pretty mellow as long as they're informed. So pick if you're gonna be writing a will and picking your personal representative, pick the child who communicates well, okay? Because that's the person, that's the person who's really gonna make sure that the other siblings don't jump down their throat, because they're always telling them things. People don't usually have an issue as long as they're informed. It can also result in delayed decisions, right? So when probate happens with a real estate property, you can't list it tomorrow, right? I have to make sure you get domiciliary letters. We have to make sure the creditor's period passed. We have to make sure that if we do sell it during that creditor's period, that money's safe kept somewhere, that it can be used for creditors. It's a whole nother process, right? It's very different than when you sell a house and you inherited a house off of a transfer on death deed. You do whatever you want with that property. We're not waiting on anything.
And more often than not, what we see is the property is where most of the money in the estate is. So it's like all tied up in the equity. Oftentimes there's not additional money set aside to take care of it. So it's a bummer.
So some key takeaways. Probate is incredibly common in Wisconsin, but it's avoidable and manageable, right? I don't want people to think like, oh, we have to go through probate. You 1,000% can avoid probate. You just have to set up your documents correctly, your properties correctly. Everybody go home and check your deeds and make sure that there's more than one person listed on it. If there's not, we need to meet and you come see me and we fix that so that we can avoid probate. Probate's manageable. It's not a walk in the park. It's not fun by any means, but it is something that you definitely can handle. And your personal representative's role is critical. If you are either thinking about being a personal representative for someone, buckle up. People ask me and I'm like, put someone else. Because it is a lot of work. And then the real estate needs an active oversight. That's incredibly important when there's a reverse mortgage. I had a client who had a reverse mortgage that essentially ate the property in the time it took us to get a domiciliary letter, because it was so aggressive that we didn't stand a chance. And it didn't help them that they waited a year to come get an attorney. And they tried to do things on their own, which unsuccessfully, but that's one of the biggest things is when there's real estate in probate, you do not get to wait. It's something you need to move on. And then, like I said, if you plan ahead, you can avoid probate. There's so many tricks in Wisconsin to avoid probate. I know everyone always gets really intimidated with an estate plan. It's going to cost me so much. It's so involved. Wisconsin has a lot of really great, user-friendly, cheap options to just say, hey, this is a Band-Aid. It's maybe not the perfect fit, but it will keep you out of probate. Sometimes that's just the goal, right? I have some families who want a complex estate plan, and then I have others who, hey, keep me out of probate. happy to do that. If you come to our office, our big thing is I want to do everything in my power to keep you out of probate, because as much as I would love to see you again, I do not want to see you again for probate, right?
Adding on to that, like what I see from the real estate side of things is, Megan kind of hit on this already, is the biggest thing is costs. The heirs are the ones who unfortunately suffer when there isn't a plan in place, because mortgage, taxes, insurance, utilities, it all adds up. And if the people are out of state, then there's the added stress of figuring out, okay, do I have to pay somebody to now come and maintain this property because I'm not nearby? Like, how are we going to get this done? Because in real estate, maintenance is one of the biggest killers of deals. If properties are not kept up, we're in a strong market right now, and it is 100% still a seller's market. But if properties are not kept up and they're not presenting well and they're not listed right, then they're not selling. There are things that are sitting even in this market. And usually it has to do with maintenance and buyers being scared that they're taking on too much kind of thing. So then condition, like I kind of said, deferred maintenance, and then communication. And so the financial reality, the cost of waiting, depending on the mortgage cost, the taxes, you're looking at $2,000 to $3,000 a month. And that adds up very, very quickly. And if you are going through 18 months of probate, that is a huge cost that your heirs are taking on while you go through the probate process.